All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for our Octopus Deploy and Flyway integration webinar. My name is Bob Walker. I'm a technical director at Octopus Deploy, and today I'm joined by Steve Jones, the database extraordinaire himself. Steve, how are you doing today?
Good, Bob. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Now, I do realize that we have some folks that have joined us from both the Octopus side as well as the Redgate side in terms of registration, so they might not be familiar with us. Steve, would you mind giving a brief overview of yourself?
Sure. So I'm Steve Jones. I work for Redgate Software as an advocate and architect. I've been doing that. Well, I've been at Redgate 16 years, but I've been working with databases for over 30 years. And so I do a lot of, I've had a lot of different jobs in that time, but I've also worked with a lot of customers and clients with my work with Redgate, trying to help them be better DevOps database developers.
Awesome. I do. I have a feeling that folks probably know you a lot more than they know me. So just a little bit about me as well. My name is Bob Walker, as it says right there. And I've been at Octopus Deploy since 2018. One of the things I like to kind of hang my hat on was I was one of the first US-based employees hired by Octopus Deploy. In fact, my very first day, myself and another gentleman, we boarded a plane to Australia because we're an Australian-based company because there's no one else in the United States to onboard us. And I've worked at a number of different companies over the past 20 years. And in fact, I was an Octopus Deploy customer before I became an Octopus Deploy employee. And I don't know if you know this, Steve, but I kind of had a interesting worlds collide type of moment with Redgate, because the very first time I was introduced to Octopus Deploy was when Redgate was helping us set up a proof of concept using Redgate's DLM tooling.
Oh, I didn't know that. Early on when we were doing the DevOps stuff, I did a lot of work with Octopus, back then as the deployment tool. So I'm glad that we got you a new job. Is that what we did?
Yeah. Well, at least it got me very passionate about the database deployments, because that was the very first time I ever successfully deployed automatically from development all the way up to production. Because most of the time it was just to say development or test. And so that to me was also, that's why I was really excited by getting the chance to talk to you as well.
Oh, that's cool. Well, yeah. Thanks. I'm glad. I know we haven't had much chance to get together, but hopefully that'll change here in the future.
Yeah. But let's talk about today. So today our focus is going to be on Flyway and the Flyway integration within Octopus Deploy. Now, I do realize that not everyone might not be familiar with both those tools. So I'm going to do a kind of a brief overview of Octopus Deploy, and then Steve will do a brief overview of Flyway. So if you're not familiar with Octopus Deploy, we are a deployment automation tool, and its primary goal is to make your deployments to production less stressful. One of the taglines I like to use is deploying to production shouldn't be a big production. And that's because how you deploy to production will be the exact same way you deploy to dev, that you deploy to tests, staging, production. And by the time you get to production, everything works because I've already tested the scripts, I've tested the process. I'm going to have no surprises. If any surprises do occur, they are truly big surprises. Now, you do see on the screen that we have out-of-the-box support for Linux, Kubernetes, Windows, and other platform as a service software hosts. But when it comes to the database, we integrate with a variety of tools, specifically Flyway, because why try to reinvent the wheel when someone's already done it better for the database deployments? So for the folks that aren't familiar with Flyway, Steve, would you want to give kind of the elevator pitch for that?
Sure. So Flyway is it's a way to deploy scripts to database servers. It started as an open source project, and a few years ago, Redgate actually purchased it. Now we still maintain the open source project, and then we've added a lot of additional functionalities. Obviously, we're a for-profit company, so we want people to become better at deploying their software to different databases. And so we've enhanced Flyway in many ways, and we'll look at some of those today. But essentially, it's a way to ensure that we execute what needs to be run against a particular database, whatever platform it is. We don't execute things multiple times, and we integrate with tools such as Octopus to make this a smooth, hands-off, push-button deployment process.
I tell you what, one of the things I was super excited about when I started getting a chance to play around with Flyway was the support for all the different database technologies, specifically Snowflake. I've been doing a ton of analysis in our data warehouse, and we leverage Snowflake quite extensively. So when I saw that in there, I was like, ooh, I'm really excited by that.
Yeah, yeah, it's quite a spread of technologies, and we're working on more and more all the time.
Yeah. So for the demonstration today, I kind of want to set the roadmap so everyone kind of has an understanding of what to expect. And my goal today is I want to answer two big questions, which is where do these tools fit into the deployment pipeline? And then how do they augment one another? And so today, what you're going to see at the very beginning is I'm going to check in a change using Flyway Desktop into version control. And then once I'm done doing that, then I'm going to go ahead and push that up to GitHub. And that will kick off a GitHub action. And that GitHub action will build my source code as well as my package up my database and the build artifact for my source code and push that over to Octopus Deploy, which will handle the deployments. Then when it comes to pushing out to our SQL database, we're going to be leveraging Flyway to push out to Azure SQL. Now, I guess one of the questions that I always like to ask before we jump into the demonstration is, most of the time when it comes to branching strategies, specifically for, say, demonstrations like this. Now, Steve, have you ever had a situation where you had a change from a feature branch go all the way up to production, or did you have some sort of like merge process as well?
Yeah, I mean, typically, I think, I'm on, right? Yeah, yeah. I've done something like what you show here, where we developers will branch something off of their trunk or their main development branch, and then we'll merge it back in as needed. I got to say, Bob, a lot of things with our customers, because the database side is a little more maybe critical or foundational than code, we often recommend release branching out from main because the order of the work here, like you've shown 2 feature branches here, multiple commits, which could be 2 feature, right? It could be 2 pieces of work, could be 5 pieces of work, but the order of those sometimes causes a problem in the database, which is often different than software. So we do recommend release branching so that if there's a reason for DBAs to reorder work, they can do that.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I'm going to do a little bit more simplistic, more code-based for this demonstration, but that's really good information to know as well. So I'm going to go ahead and let's jump over to the demonstration itself. And so I'm going to be using Flyway Desktop. And this is the first experience I had leveraging Flyway Desktop, specifically the enterprise version of it. And I got to admit, the workflow felt very familiar to me coming over from SQL Source Control. So Steve, could you give us like a high-level overview of what Flyway Desktop is and kind of where it came about?
Sure. So this is kind of a standalone app. It's built on kind of the Electron framework, like a lot of modern apps are, right? Like GitHub Desktop or different tools. And what we really wanted to do is, because we're going cross-platform and we want to work with many different databases, we built a separate tool that allows you to kind of manage your code and commit to version control without worrying about whatever IDE you use to do the development. So in SQL Server, people use Management Studio. People might use Data Grip in Oracle or Foglight or something like that. They might use something different in Snowflake. And so what we really wanted to do is give them a way to manage code. And so we built this app that has, as you can kind of see at the top, these 4 tabs where we capture the various object code, which is the first one, the schema model. We give you some generate migration capability to generate scripts in a consistent format. The migrations tab really is an overlay on the file system that Flyway uses, because Flyway is text file based. It was running net code from text files. And then version control obviously is just a kind of a mini Git client there as well. But the idea was kind of give you some way to manage your code separate from IDEs.
And so I already have a change all ready to go. I made the world's simplest change by adding a column onto an existing table. And I'm going to go ahead and basically check this change. And what I want to do is I'm going to save this to the project. And so this is saving to the schema model folder in my version control, in my file system itself.
Right. Yeah. It's in the Git repo, but it is on your local file system, right?
Yep. But now, so that's just the schema model itself. But I also need to come in and I need to generate some migration scripts. And so I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah, you click this, Bob. This leverages a compare technology. I'm sure you've used compare in the past, right?
Oh, yep.
And so we've integrated SQL Compare into here, so it's doing what SQL Compare would do and generate these. But we've also started to enhance our comparison technology to work on other platforms, and I'm hoping Snowflake will appear. I hate to say this quarter, maybe H2. I think it's due
soon.
Soon.
And so what I did here, and as I configured the development database, that's where I made my change, but I also configured a shadow database. And so I imagine that's what the compare technology is leveraging.
Right. Well, it's leveraging that a little bit, but we also, once you get done here, it will apply whatever migration you build to that shadow.
Yep.
So this is that first practice step to verify that, as you said, this deployment to production won't be a production.
So I'm going to go ahead and generate the script, and it's going to kind of figure out all of the stuff behind the scenes for me.
Yep.
Now,
go ahead, Bob.
I was going to say, if I was going to be like, if I was a proper DBA, I would have written the script myself, because this is one of the easiest scripts in the world to write. But yeah, go ahead.
Maybe, but you probably wouldn't have put those set statements in there, and you certainly wouldn't have added the logging, right? Like I don't do that either.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and say add description to tenant.
So you've typed that, right? He's actually going to create a new text file here, which we'll save.
Yep.
Up at the top, you see there's a schema model, which is the code, and then the migrations folder that Bob was just pointing to is where we're actually saving that script file with that name.
Yep. And it follows the format that Flyway understands, which I think is really important, because I want to say I probably messed up when I did like 1_ the very first time I ever used Flyway. There's a certain naming convention it expects.
Yeah, I mess that up regularly as well.
So I'm going to go over to version control, and I'm going to create a new branch for this. And I'm just going to call this feature tenant description, and go ahead and click on create. And so then I'm going to add my commit message. And so I'm going to say add.
Yep. And so one of the nice things here, because we're getting this client, like Bob is now committing the change to the object code, which is what we humans often want to look at, along with the code that will run in production, the migration script, so that when I go to version control, I can see those together. I can relate those items.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one question that I have is that kind of that flow of that schema model, generate migrations, is that available for every version of Flyway? Is this kind of workflow more of that Flyway enterprise?
So that's really the enterprise. That's where we've kind of added the value in generate migrations. So the schema model piece would be there for the Teams version, which is our middle tier. And then in the free version, what we really just have is this version control tab. So you do get this get client and this migrations tab, which is, if you show this shows all of the scripts that Bob has actually run. And so what we allow you to do is here, see a list of the scripts for this project. And if you were to configure a database over on the right, it would tell you which of those scripts have been applied to the database or not. So if you'd picked your production database or QA or something, you could see the status of what's been applied there. And then that helps you know. Now, he picked development here. These are all set as pending because we made the changes. We don't need to run these scripts to actually make those changes. But if you had a QA database, you might see some of these as successful and some of these as pending. And certainly in production, whatever had been deployed, which I assume would be 2 to 6, would be shown as success, and 7 would be pending.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead back over here, and I'm going to go ahead and push these changes up to GitHub. So let's jump over to GitHub. And so I have an action that's configured, assuming that I configured it, I typed everything in correctly. I did.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
So I have an action that's configured, and it's designed to look for any any branch with feature / at the very beginning, as well as main. And so it will automatically trigger, and it's the same action.
Right.
And I'm not going to spend a ton of time in here because it's not super duper exciting. This is probably the world's simplest action, and I don't even have unit tests, although I should have unit tests inside of here. But what it's doing is I'm building both the website as well as I'm packaging up my database changes and packaging up my website. And I'm going to push this over to Octopus Deploy to handle all this. But in the if I was coming back through and I was iterating on this, this would be the place where I'd have my unit tests. I probably want to run some database validation in terms of like SQL fluff or anything along those lines, some sort of static analysis to make sure everything is looking good.
Right. Yeah, and I think, for us, you've got the web code and the database code in one repository. And I would say about maybe half of our clients do that, and about half would separate those into 2 repositories so that they can build and deploy code without worrying about database changes accidentally slipping through, or vice versa.
Yeah, that's to me is it's an interesting concept, and I have a lot of opinions about that. But for all the applications I worked on, we typically coupled the both of them together because almost always we had database changes were coupled with our code changes, and so I wanted to push everything out at the same time. I didn't want to have one thing go out or not the other.
And I get that. I have a lot of people do that. I would say that, as I work with more clients that try to approach zero downtime and they want to avoid problems, we separate deploy from release. And part of doing that, right, in the web side, you would use feature flags or feature toggles. In the database side, what we often want to do is separate out the database, because I might need to make 2 or 3 changes to the database, some of which could take time. And so I don't want to be holding up other web unrelated deployments.
That's
right.
100% correct. Yeah. So but you have to make that full decoupling from your database changes and your code changes. So
you sure do.
Whatever database changes you make, they have to be backward compatible with the version of code that's currently running in production.
Yeah, and that's the way we do it. And for the clients that really are trying to get good at this, we often will, deploy database, deploy app, deploy database, deploy app. And we may have those linked, because often if we deploy the database, we do want to deploy an app change, but not necessarily the reverse.
Yeah.
Right. So so often this in Octopus, the database deploy would kick off the app deploy, but the app deploy doesn't kick off the database deploy.
Correct. Yes. And not only that, it's in a lot of ways, if you've been talking to customers about this, so I imagine it's really kind of focused on that expand contract pattern.
Correct.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump into the overview as we're talking. And so if you haven't had a chance to look at Octopus Deploy, I kind of want to just show you around a little bit. So right now we're on the task summary screen, and this shows us a list of all of the steps that we're going to run for this deployment. And right now we're on step 3. And so what it's doing is it's performing a dry run, and we're checking the database changes. And so we're leveraging Flyway for this. And while this is processing, let me kind of highlight a few other spots over here. Is I have a list of all of the different changes that are going out. And so you can see that I have this change that's gone out, and then you can see all of the commits history up until this particular point. In addition to that, we also have the task history, and this shows who triggered the build, and we can see it was triggered 3 minutes ago. You can see who, like the person who did it. In our case, it's the GitHub Actions user. And this is going to stay, all of this information is going to stay here as long as this deployment exists within the system. And by default, it stays until the end of time. And if you want more details than just a summary, we can jump over into the task log itself. And this will provide you much more information as to what's going on. And so we can see, so for example, while we're looking at this, we can see all of the commands that are being run. And we can see the actual command that I've executed for Flyway, as well as anything else that's appropriate for it, including all of the parameters and everything like that. And one of the other things is that when Flyway finishes running, it generates a file called a report.html file, as well as I think it generates a JSON file. But our integration will see that, and it'll automatically suck up that report file and save it as an artifact as part of the deployment. So I can come in here and I can download it, and I can see all of these changes. I really like this new reports syntax that Flyway's put together.
Yeah, we lightly added some of the SQL compare, and we found that when you do have problems, right, when it is a production deploying, it's nice to just come in here and quickly go, what happened, which is what we try to summarize here, and then get the details, right? I think that's what's been invaluable when I've used Octopus, is that when something does go wrong, I can go back and see all the logging and say, where did something go wrong? And then I can backtrack to the commits, or I can backtrack, as you see here, to the actual code to say, what did this potentially cause me a problem with.
Yeah. And for the purposes of this demonstration, each time I do a deployment to dev, I have a step that goes in and configures the database. We'll get into that in just a little bit. But for dev, I actually have it run the clean command so I can see like what a full report would look like if I'm going to do a whole bunch of changes, but then we'll actually get to see the small incremental changes when we merge things into main. But what I also like about this is I can see all of the actual commands that are going to run. So I get both the what's going to change as well as what are the scripts that are going to change it, which I think is a huge win, because before it was, here are all the scripts that are going to change. And if they're massive scripts, you're kind of like, well, what's exactly going to change?
Right. And this is where you get the DBAs or operations staff comfortable with using Octopus, using Flyway, because they can actually see the code that's going to run, just as if a developer had emailed them a script and said, hey, this is what I need to go to production. Which I agree with you, right? It's invaluable to try to be confident this will work and also troubleshoot when things go wrong.
I did do a couple other things that I don't know if you've done in the past where, so I'm doing the dry run and then you're going to see it goes from step 3 to step 6. We'll get into step 4 and step 5 in just a little bit. But then I deploy the database, but then I'm also checking for drift post-release. Is that something you typically will do as well after you deploy your migration scripts?
Sometimes. I tell you, often it depends on your risk tolerance, right, and how your environment works. But some people will check pre-release, some people will check post-release. And as a matter of fact, we have some flags that would, if we detect drift, meaning that what we last deployed and what we see in production are different, for a DBA added an index or changed something else, we can pause or warn you, because potentially drift would cause issues later on, right, in some sense. And so that's why we put that check in there, and you have the ability to do it kind of pre or post, and then determine how do we want to action on that, right? Because I will say, right, as much as I have a lot of clients that love this DevOps, that use Octopus, that they do automated deploys, we still find people will make changes in production, because when things are broken and there's an emergency, you just have to do it.
Yeah. That temptation is there to just be like, well, I just need to make that quick change in production without recognizing the long-term consequences sometimes. And so you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And I mean, and sometimes it's warranted, right? Like we see certainly people in operations will tune a database and they might add an index then. And if that doesn't get sent back to development, then the developers are unaware of that, and that could cause issues. But we also see cases where developers make mistakes, right? They delete something they shouldn't have deleted. It does get deployed, and we have to fix that very quickly. So I do understand why people do it, and I don't have a solution.
So one of the things that I have configured for this particular deployment process is I have this configured to fail if the drift detects any sort of change. And then when that happens, this leverages the Octopus Deploy guided failure mode. And what that does, so this is the use guided failure. And so what that does is it will pause the deployment itself, and it will allow maybe a DBA or somebody to take a look at it. It's like, okay, why did this drift occur? And you can either go, well, that's not right, and you need to fix it and make sure that it's all okay. Or you can just ignore it, go, you know what? I'm actually aware of that drift. It's not that big of a deal right now. I'm going to just go ahead and proceed. So it'll give you a chance to make that decision right then and there without causing any sort of havoc. So you get a chance to review it if it does pop up like that.
And Bob, actually, that's one of the things I love about using tools like Octopus Deploy, is that you can ensure that runs every time. Because we as humans will forget that sometimes we might overlook drift. It might be Friday afternoon and we want to go home, and we kind of, it slips by us, but Octopus will say, no, I'm going to alert everybody. And then somebody has to say continue or don't continue.
Yep, absolutely. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and create a pull request. So let's pretend that everything looks good in development. We're happy with everything. And I'm going to create a pull request. And one of the things I always love about this process in and of itself is that my database changes, but I can see my files that are going to be changing. If I had any code changes, so if I was working on an application where the database and code changes were tightly coupled together, I could see also all the code changes in this pull request. So everything's going to get checked in and merged in at the exact same time. And so I'm going to go ahead and also break a rule, which is I'm going to merge without anybody approving my changes, just for this demonstration.
Yeah, I do that all the time when I demo things. Say, like, please don't do this. I'm just trying to get it done.
Yeah, yeah, you have branch protection policies for a reason. Now, this will trigger another action as well, because if we think back to the diagram that I showed earlier, is that we might have had other changes get merged into main. And so we need to rebuild our code. We need to package up all the database changes, including everything. And then that's what we're going to push up to Octopus Deploy. But while we're waiting for that, I kind of want to dive into the process a little bit more, because I think it's important to understand one of the core tenets of Octopus Deploy, which is we define this process once. So this is going to be the exact same process that we use in development, in test, staging, as well as production. But we can turn on and off steps based on the environment we're going to. So I have these 2 steps to only run on our staging environment. In addition to that, we also have variables. And this allows us to have some differentiation. In my case, I'm deploying everything to the same database server as more of just a demo purpose. Real world, you would probably be deploying to different database servers, ideally in different environments. But you can scope variables to different environments. So in my dev environment, I'm scoping the name to Trident _dev. But when I'm going to production, I just call it Trident or anything along those lines. On top of that, we also have sensitive variables. And so these are variables that are encrypted at rest inside of Octopus Deploy. So much so that I can't even get access to those variables in our UI. So once you write it to the database, we can't ever access it again in the UI. The only time it's ever decrypted is during deployment or a runbook run.
And more importantly, Bob, like you showed the logs, those values were not in the logs, even though everything else was, right? The sensitive values are not there.
Yep. If we go back to the deployment itself, you'll see we'll blank those out. So if we come over here into you'll see that it's starred out in our log. So we'll see that that's a sensitive value and go, nope, we don't want to expose that out there, even though we're writing all that information by accident. So yeah, we'll make sure that any of those items that are marked as sensitive, we'll do our very level best to make sure they're not leaked into our logs as well.
And this is how you can have non-privileged people that might not know the password still use Octopus to do deployments, and right, they could reconfigure steps and things, and they still don't have access to those sensitive values.
Correct. You're 100% right. And in fact, I'll show you a process that I put together in just a little bit to handle some of like the data funk issues that you might run into. But before I do that, let's jump into some of those steps, specifically our Flyway steps. So this is the Flyway step that we have created for within Octopus Deploy. And we have the capability to run a number of different commands. So from the usual migrate that everyone is very familiar with, to doing things such as clean, which I make very clear do not use against a production database. But one of the things I really like about this is that we can also store different items such as your license key, your URL, your authentication mechanism. I'm being lazy and I just used username and password, but if you want to do any of the managed identities, definitely have support for that, as well as where we stored those migration files and anything else that's needed for the deployment to be successful. All of this very specific information, such as what database I'm going to, what's my authentication. So none of that has to be stored inside of your source control. You don't have to worry about that because you might be adding new databases. You might change your database, and you'd only have to change it in Octopus. You don't have to go to all of your Git repositories and change all that. Now, I am using migrate for this command, but for my dry run, I'm using check changes. Now, check is one of the new pieces of functionality Redgate's added to Flyway. This is kind of new to me. So, Steve, I wonder if you can just kind of give a high-level overview of what it does. I mean, we kind of saw what it does, but what were some of the concepts behind it?
So the idea, with Flyway is that I should be able to build a reliable, repeatable process that works all the time. And so we've added, as you see in these docs here, various new commands that would help us practice and prepare and develop comfort that everything we do will work in production so that it's smooth. So check changes that you can see here at the top is to try to help you determine at a high level what changes are actually happening, and what the overview is, as well as the script is in there. The drift piece is then to say, has the production or the target, let's just say target, because I might care about, staging or something else in this case. Is it different than what I expect it to be in? And that's where I can potentially catch problems from people making changes in production. Dry run actually gives me that final script, which gives DBAs that final approval to say, yes, we think this is okay. It conforms to whatever rules we might have. And then lastly, we've started to realize that there's more to it than just making sure that things compile. And so for a long time, Bob, I'm sure you've done development for a long time. For me, I started in C and assembler and other things. Mm-hmm. And we always had these things called linters that would perform static code analysis. And for a while, I think linters started to fall out of favor, but it started to come back a little more as people have done more unit testing in the last decade. And so we've built some integrations that will help you check your code statically without an actual database to determine if things work correctly. And so maybe the classic example is we don't want to allow a select star because that's right. It may or may not be backwards compatible, and we don't then know what results we're getting, right? There's a lot of reasons why select star is bad. So we've integrated with SQL Fluff, which is an open source project that does linting on SQL code. And then we also have kind of a regex analysis thing built into the Flyway system that you can write your own types of rules to say, we don't want to allow these certain things to happen. For example, I have a lot of customers that pause or stop if there's any sort of drop in there, because it's not that we don't want to allow drop commands, because there are valid reasons we do, but a lot of junior developers, a lot of people maybe inexperienced in our code base might inappropriately try to drop something or prematurely drop something. So we often have rules in there that would say, we don't allow this, we don't allow that. Another classic one is we don't often allow developers to manage security. So anything that would do with logins or users, credentials, encryption, we might stop that stuff with SQL Fluff and say, we don't allow that code to go through. And we might have a separate Octopus pipeline for DBAs to actually make those sorts of privilege changes.
Yep. No, that makes a ton of sense. And speaking of SQL Fluff, and speaking of Flyway in and of itself, and this is a Python, it's a Python package.
Yep.
You might notice here, the eagle-eyed person might notice here that I'm running everything on a container image. And so this is a Docker image that we've put together for Flyway. And the reason I picked 9.20 specifically is that's a newer version that I just released. And that has SQL Fluff, the Python package, built into it. It's already packaged with it. And so expect hopefully that I can get the check code command added to this command as well. So you get not only Flyway built in, but you also get the SQL Fluff, so you kind of get everything all in one package.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, and I'm a big fan of using containers to do this type of work because it just reduces the load on my workers, right? My agent.
Yeah, and I can, and you can specify a specific version here, or I could do something like latest if you want to live on the bleeding edge. But what I really like about it is what I really like about it is that it'll also make sure that if my package is only going to work with 7.7 of Flyway, I can pick 7.7. That's available to us. So you get to, you know that it's going to work. There's not this guess of, well, I hope it works with the new version. It's like, no, I know it's going to work because I've picked this very specific version.
And I assume, Bob, I could, across my Octopus environment, I could query somehow and find out which versions of containers I was using.
Yeah, you could. Yes, you can do that. It's not, as I say, it's not readily available in terms of like the user interface, but yeah, right. It is completely possible using an API script.
Okay, yeah, because I mean, I'm a big fan of doing that. At the same time, I also don't want old code to live forever, right? We want to force people to upgrade, quarterly, yearly, something.
And what I would probably recommend someone do then is, so you have the ability to bind this to a variable, is to store it as a shared variable. And so you could have, okay, these are the official versions of Flyway that we support. And then you can find who's referencing those variables, and they will stick out like a sore thumb.
Yeah. No, and that's a great way to manage this across time, because Once you start using Octopus, you'll use it for everything. And so you'll have a lot of these processes.
Exactly. Now, I mentioned earlier that I've configured my drift to fail if any sort of change is detected, but I didn't do that inside of my step. Although I could have provided it as an additional argument. Rather, I did that in my configuration file. So if I come to Flyway and I scroll way down, there it is. You'll see that I had fail on drift equals true. Yep. Now, I guess my question to you, Steve, would you have preferred that I did that inside of Octopus, or do you think storing something like that in the configuration file is an appropriate way to do it?
Well, I think that's really one of those tough things to say you should do it this way or that way. You know, the idea with the configuration file is that there's so many options, right? Like as Bob scrolled, you saw all those things commented out, and you see all these options here, right? So there's dash this, dash that. Entering all those on a command line is hard. Entering those in the Flyway, I mean, I think some people might find those to be tedious, right? To set those different things. Whereas if I do it in a configuration file, I can drop that in my repo, and I could have different configuration files for different environments. So as Bob showed, you have 4 environments, I think, that you're deploying to. I could set 4 different configuration files, which could include not only the connection string, but all of these options as well. And so I think I go back and forth depending on what I'm doing. I like having it in the repo because if somebody changes an option, it flags on pull requests.
Yep.
Right. So it's one more place where potentially we go, hey, do we really want that option changed or not? Which is valuable. And if I do it in Octopus, you have the logging, right? We know the different versions of a process over time, but I guess I might say it feels less visible to me if I'm doing the development side of things. Whereas if I'm doing the admin side of things, operations, maybe I like it in Octopus more, right? Yep. So I think it's who's responsible for this?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. And I didn't configure this for this demonstration, although it was on my to-do list. But you can store the Octopus deployment process in a Git repo, so I could store this in the same Git repository if I chose to do so.
Okay. See, and that would be good, right?
Then I would get that. Yeah, then I would get that pull request functionality that you were talking about as well.
Right. Because to me, the pull request thing is just this last chance for a human to notice: do we really want to do it or not do this?
Yeah, exactly. So one other thing, speaking of that Flyway configuration file, I found a very cheeky change in there, and I wanted to talk about it. But in order to talk about it, you have to kind of understand that one of the things that I do in my process is I'm configuring the database server at the very beginning. And so this is running a Octopus Deploy runbook. Now, I'm kind of curious, Steve, in your travels, have you had much experience using the runbook functionality within Octopus?
Not within Octopus. I have used a little bit in the Azure world.
Okay. All right. So this is a good primer for everything.
Yeah.
So I have so runbooks are designed to perform maintenance tasks that aren't strictly deployments. So you can see I have 4 runbooks right now. I have clean databases. So when I was setting up this demonstration, to keep my cloud costs low, I would delete all my databases every night. But I wanted to make sure those databases existed at the beginning of the day or when I started my deployment. And so I have a process in place that will create the database if it doesn't exist. And then when I'm in development, I'll run the clean command that will clean the database if it does already exist. And then I'm also creating my check database in order for all the dry run stuff to work appropriately. And then I notify everyone that, hey, this was successful. But this is where I found the cheeky change that's in the Flyway config file, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's like, if you enable clean, that could be a career limiting move.
Yeah, I think that's Grant's influenced my coworker on that career limiting move. But yeah, clean is designed to kind of wipe everything out of the database so that you can run the full suite of migration scripts and verify that all my scripts work. And I think one of the reasons we did that is that we find so much broken code in production, Bob. I'm absolutely stunned how many people have broken database code in production.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I can only imagine, and I'm always stunned as well. I guess that's one of the reasons I did this in development. Is so we run all of the migrations in development, so we kind of fail fast. If it
Right.
doesn't work in development, you got big problems because it's
Right.
the simplest database.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see that with customers that try to adopt this and try to set up new databases that if they script it out production, they actually can't run that script because it's invalid. And then we had spent a lot of time trying to clean that script. Of course, they don't want to clean production for some reason, but
One of the other run books that I put in here is to run a ad hoc data script. I put in there the quote unquote data funk. And so I've seen this happen quite a number of times of apps that I worked on where code will get into some weird state and it'll cause some sort of two pieces of data not to be exactly synced up in your database, despite your best efforts. And so you have to go in and you have to run some random script just for that to work appropriately. And so what this does is allows you to do that, but it provides guardrails for you. So I'm emailing out everything to people like, hey, this is what you submitted, this is the script you submitted. And then we can also check the script for certain things, certain commands. So if I see create table, drop table, basically any sort of create statement outside of update, delete, insert, then I want someone to take a look at this. Or if it's going to change more than, say, 10 records. This is a very simplistic auto approval, so yours is probably going to be much more robust. But again, This is putting guardrails in place. And so I'm basically executing the transaction, and then I'm going to roll it right back, just to give it see what's going to happen with it. And if there's any sort of problems, I'm going to have a DBA take a look at it and go, we want to verify this, and no, we don't want this to happen, type of thing. But it provides those guardrails. So if I needed to do this in production quickly, I could do it, but I'd also get all of that auditing. And I get this built-in process that everyone would have to follow at the same time.
Yeah, no, I love that, Bob. The only thing I worry, just being a former DBA, is that somebody will put a script that will actually make a lot of changes and have a lot of time. And so before the rollback happens, it's just eating time and blocking things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so that is definitely a concern. And so that would be something that you would probably want to have someone several iterations would want to go through on something like this.
Right. Yeah. Make sure we don't accidentally break something.
Yeah, absolutely. So while we've been sitting here talking, it finished up the deployments to test. And I just wanted to show what a typical report should look like, because we're not going to see everything under the sun. All we're going to see is just one change that's occurred.
Right.
And so I see my change report. I've added in my tenant table. See the description column was added. I see the dry run statement. So I just wanted to show what that would actually look like. Now, one of the things we haven't taken a look at is what the experience will be like in staging. And all of our deployments so far have been automatically triggered. So what is it like when, say, a DBA wants to trigger this, or a web admin? So one of the things I absolutely fell in love with Octopus when I first saw this, I don't know about you, was the ability to schedule a deployment to be later. And it's such a simple thing. You wouldn't think about it. But, I had so many DBAs who were like, man, I don't want to be the person that has to come online at 8 p.m. and all I have to do is click the deploy button. What a waste of my time. And so we could schedule this to run at 8 p.m. now. Now, we're not going to make everyone wait 7 hours and 16 minutes. No one wants to do that. But you have the capability to do that if you want to do something like that. Typically, I imagine it's probably going to be much more appealing for someone who has to get at, say, 2 a.m. to do a deployment.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. Like, one of the things I've loved about Octopus is that this UI is very smooth and easy for me to see. I know there's a lot of information if you're seeing it for the first time, but once you've used it, you start to know very quickly, right? Here's my scheduling time. Here's what's going to go. As you said, you showed over here on the right, here's what the commits, here's the history. Like, you don't often look at this information, but it's super handy when you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also get, exactly, you can see who is the Yahoo who went ahead and triggered this up to staging. Now, one of the things that we're going to be running in this environment that we haven't run in previous environments is step 4 and step 5, which is the ability of what we're going to be doing is pausing the deployments and getting a chance for a DBA to do kind of that final verification before we go to staging and before it's ready to go up to production. Now, Steve, putting your DBA hat on, was that one of the bigger hurdles that you had to overcome, was kind of this fear of, oh, if I automate this, I'm going to completely destroy my database?
I mean, I didn't have that fear so much, because early on, I started doing this stuff, boy, Bob, back in like 99. And so
Yeah.
I was trying to automate my own code so that it would work smoothly. And I certainly didn't have that scheduling thing. So I did log on at 8 p.m. Wednesday night and make those deployments. But we did like the idea to put in gates and stop deployments, because as we deploy this out, like, I don't want to have to make all these deployments myself, right? That I want to be able to assign these to a junior person or maybe a senior developer or somebody else, but I don't want them to necessarily do it without me being aware. So it's nice to have somebody go, I'm going to do this release, I'll get it going, but let's have the DBA review it. And I actually am a big fan of gating staging and not necessarily production. So that's DBA
that's exactly what I did here.
Yeah. So we go, right, because if I'm busy right now, if I'm at lunch or something and I can't do this, it's not the end of the world if we delay this release for an hour, right, or a day. But once I've signed off on this, once I've done this, then we want it to go to production. I don't want to have to be involved in that, because I should be confident at this point it's going to go.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm kind of the same way. What was interesting to me was when I started automating the deployments, specifically on the database side, it was the DBAs. They're like, I'm all for it. I don't have to get up in the middle of the night to push the deploy button. I get all this control. I get this guaranteed process. Everyone's going to have to follow it. I'm all for it. Strangely enough, it was the database developers who were making the day-to-day changes on the database. They're like, oh, what happens if a developer checks in a change and it has drop table customers and something inside there? So,
right. Yeah.
And so
I think they are more worried because they know right. Like I always tell our customer, right, the quality of your staff is just going to vary, right? We're not all experts. We're not all idiots, but the quality can vary and you never know who will do the change. So, I certainly understand why DBAs once they're involved in this process and they see Octopus, they get very comfortable with this.
Oh, yeah. And so what we've done here is basically we've intentionally slowed down our deployment. And that's okay, especially as you're building out that trust at the very beginning, and you just want to make sure. And so a DBA, they could, just like we've done before, they could download the file, they can verify it. They go, yeah, that looks good to me. And from here, I can come in here and go, I can either do, yeah, it looks good to me, or if I saw something in there that I wasn't expecting to see happen, I go, you know what? That's not right. I'm going to go ahead and abort this change. That should not have happened whatsoever. And that's perfectly okay, because all we've done now is we've just configured a database and we've just done some dry runs. We haven't done any deployments whatsoever. So aborting now, zero risk compared to letting this go through, and there might be some big risk inside of it. But I'm going to go ahead and click on proceed, because just to push this all the way through. So now one of the things that I probably would do is make use of that check code change. And so that's one of the things that I was looking into in the future for that iteration. Maybe have that as part of step 3 is I'm doing the check changes, and it's also going to do dry run, but then also maybe run some code that will do some of that static analysis at the same time on the migrations that are about to run. And maybe I only do that on dev versus just doing the dry run and check changes on test staging and production. That's certainly possible as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you might, for me, I might do it in both places, because the developer runs that go, to something like an integration will happen often, and operations people may not care. It maybe just be too much noise for them, but having some sort of linting occur here when you release the staging. So that's when operations will actually look at this and go, all right, what's being done is always good, right? And I think having the DBAs have impact or influence into what we're going to check with SQL Fluff is how we push things to the left more, right? We catch them earlier.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the big thing to think about is that no deployment process that I've ever been involved with for an application that's always going to production ever stays static. You always want to shift more and more to the left. You're always learning different ways. Oh, a new feature was released in this tool. Like check code. That didn't exist back when I first started using Flyway. So now that it's there, I'm like, oh, I want to add that in there.
Right. And that's the beauty of doing this in Octopus, right? Because it's all configured here and it runs every time. if we want to, we could just add something, say, let's add this additional change or this check.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So that pretty much covered everything that I wanted to cover in the demonstration. So let's think back to the questions that we wanted to answer. Where do the two tools fit in the deployment pipeline? I think we've answered that. And we also have answered where they augment one another, because we can see Flyway is handling the database deployments for Octopus, but Octopus is also storing all of the configuration, such as what database I want to go to, any sort of credentials, as well as it's sucking in the report file and saving that as an artifact so a DBA can review it in mid-flight, or after deployment occurs to staging or production. Someone's like, what's happening? When did this change? What changed last night? Anything along those lines. You get that capability as well. Now, before I jump over to questions, if there's any questions that are coming through, just a brief thank you for everyone. Everything that you saw today, the recording, will be sent out for everyone. In addition, we'll have links to the sample application. That's a public GitHub application, as well as having any sort of, as well as the link to the Octopus Deploy project itself that will, that shows you how to use Flyway in the real world on top of that. Awesome.
Oh. So I don't think they see any questions. Hopefully everybody, that means that we did a great job, Bob. Do you think we explained everything?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage, if you're not using a release tool like Octopus, you should get involved, because at the simplest method of doing this, you could put whatever you would run in your IDE, right, in Management Studio or Data Grip or anything else, in a folder, and Octopus could execute that for you, right? At the very least. And you could do the same thing with Flyway as well. And I think then you'll start to see there's a lot of power in having a push button, not the least of which is just being able to schedule it for a different time.
Yeah. And I always recommend, I mean, obviously I'm always going to recommend Octopus to have that consistency, especially if you're using a tool like Flyway. And it's a very, very powerful tool. It has a bunch of different options associated with it. And once you have that properly configured, you know, hey, this process is now going to be the same. There's not going to be any of those surprises. You're not going to forget, oh, I'm going to manually hand write out the migrate command, and I've fat fingered something this time. You know, we know what's going to work at this particular point.
Right. Or you cut and paste it, or figure out where you had that. Like having it in Octopus, having, you know, everything configured in Flyway just makes your life easier.
Oh yeah, and you don't make that mistake where you you pick the wrong version to migrate to. You only migrate one version, not the other one.
or to the wrong server, right? Which is something I think we've all done. Actually, I think we have a few questions, so let's hold off and see what comes through. In the meantime, please download the trials, give it a try. Download the sample application. Like it can be a great way to just get started.
And I won't lie, I try to make it as simplistic as possible, but there are a number of tables in there. And yeah, give it a shot and see what works and what doesn't work for you. So Steve, maybe this is a question that you want to answer. Is there any new feature in Flyway that is not in SQL source control plus SQL change automation?
I don't know if there's anything brand new. I mean, the static code analysis integration with SQL Fluff is new. It's more that we've evolved, right? That we learned across the last 15 years that if we do things like we did with SQL source control, which is a kind of a state or model based change, and there's plenty of products that do the same thing, that the drift in production is problematic in that some of the changes you might want to make become more difficult to make, because it's harder to split them up because you're dealing with the entire database as kind of one unit. And then the SQL change automation, the flow in the UX just wasn't as smooth with those migration scripts. Plus with Flyway, the big thing is that whatever process you've built here and how you understand it, doesn't just work on SQL Server, it will work across any featured platform. And plenty of our SQL customers are going to, Synapse/Fabric in the Microsoft world. They're going to Snowflake. We see a lot of people going to Snowflake because it's a fantastic product. We certainly see no shortage of people doing stuff in AWS as well, right? Redshift, Aurora, et cetera. So having that, consistent process it really reduces the stress on your development team because they already know things. They knowledge transfer with each other as they switch projects. This part of their work stays exactly the same.
I think what I like about the new changes that Redgate's made to Flyway is that at the beginning, especially when getting people comfortable with database automation, having that state-based, way of working, it did make a lot of sense for us. But doing the migration, but then it made a lot of sense. We needed to evolve and go to the migration-based approach, and then you just once you start doing that, you start getting Flyway as well, and it just makes a ton of sense. But what I really like about the Flyway desktop app is that I can still get that state-based approach at the very beginning, but the migration scripts are generated right then and there, and that's what's getting checked into Git. I'm not generating the migration scripts on the fly each time I do a deployment, which to me is a big difference. And that's a big win in my mind because I know exactly what scripts are going to run in each environment.
Yeah. And we do have people though that they have junior developers just use that schema model, just capture object changes. And then they have more experienced people that generate migration scripts. So they're not always, then they're not synced in version control, but you allow somebody with more experience to actually validate that migration script is what I really want to run.
So what are the advantages of using Flyway versus, say, Liquibase?
I think the big one is you could call on me for help with Octopus and Flyway, right?
Sadly, I would say most of my experience has been primarily with the Redgate tools as well as Flyway. So I don't know if I could necessarily answer that in an accurate statement.
Yeah. Certainly I'm biased, right? The answer I usually give to people is that I'm biased. I work for Redgate, and we develop and maintain Flyway as an open source and a paid product. And so Liquibase is a product that has had plenty of success, but I don't really talk about competitors' products because I'm just biased, and it's unfair for me to do that, just like it's unfair for them to talk about Flyway. You should evaluate them both and decide what works best for you, or find somebody that's independent to give you those advantages or disadvantages.
And I'm kind of the same way, especially I feel, I'm obviously biased towards Octopus Deploy, but I'm also biased towards Redgate in terms of being a friend of Redgate as well. And so any answer I give was definitely going to have that natural bias associated with it. So,
yeah, lots of people build great software. I don't like to talk poorly about anybody's products. I only can talk about what Flyway does well.
Yeah. And there's, like you said, there's always going to be disadvantages and advantages of each approach. And it just depends on which one that you prefer. So I always encourage everyone to download trials of any product that you're looking, especially for Flyway, for Liquibase, for Octopus Deploy, and make sure that it meets your needs, because you might fundamentally disagree with our philosophy that you define a process once. Some folks, they prefer no, I want to have a different process per environment. And that's perfectly fine. It really is up to you and how you want to manage your deployments.
Yeah. The thing is, though, as you showed, Bob, like with the runbooks, breaking it down into reusable components is incredibly valuable across time, and especially across staff changes and people that come and go, right? Whether that's inside and outside your company or just within teams, having known units of work that we execute the same way every time becomes really, really valuable.
Exactly. All right. I don't know if we have any other questions that have come through. Oh, no more questions. Great. Well, we'll give you 2 minutes back of your day. Well, thank you very much again, everyone, for joining us. Greatly appreciate your time. Steve, thank you for joining me. This was great.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Bob. And it's good to see you as always. And hopefully I'll shake your hand in person sometime soon.
Yeah, hopefully I'll be at PASS again this year. So.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. And please send us any questions.
Yep. Have a great one.